The applause thundered across the auditorium, rising in waves as proud families stood and clapped, some cheering loud enough to echo off the high ceiling. Caps tilted, gowns swayed, and smiles beamed brighter than the overhead lights. But amid the sea of celebration, one man stood still. He clutched his diploma with both hands, not out of excitement, but to steady the tremor in his fingers. His eyes drifted to the two reserved seats near the front. Row C, seats 12 and 13, the ones marked with simple white cards that read, "Reserved for family." His wife's favorite scarf should have been draped over one of them. His daughter's giggle should have floated over the noise like birdsong. But the seats remained untouched, empty. He'd imagined this day countless times, during sleepless nights, lonely lunches, and through the static hum of hospital monitors. In his mind, this moment had always ended in their embrace. His wife's proud tears soaking into his gown, his daughter asking, wide-eyed, if she could wear the cap. But reality had rewritten the script. A smile tugged at his lips, half-formed and quickly swallowed. He had made it. Against every odd, every setback, every shadow that told him to quit, he had crossed the finish line. But the victory was hollow, ringing like a bell in an empty church. He took a slow breath, letting it anchor him. Around him, classmates laughed and posed for photos. Parents clung to their children with open joy. And he stood, quietly, letting the noise swirl past. Today was supposed to be a beginning, a celebration of survival and persistence, but it didn't feel like the end of a journey. It felt like a page left unturned, a sentence without a period. There was a story behind those empty chairs, a long, winding one that had broken him and built him back again. He didn't know if anyone else could ever understand it, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. Before the robe, before the tassel, before the empty chairs, there was the warehouse. A concrete cave where mornings began at 4 a.m., with the screech of forklifts and the burn of cold air against skin. He loaded pallets until his arms went numb, body moving on autopilot while his mind counted the hours until class. It was the only way to make ends meet. Tuition by day, bills by night, and dreams squeezed somewhere in between. School wasn't just a goal, it was a lifeline, something to believe in when everything else felt like it was falling apart. But the path there was unrelenting. After the warehouse, he'd head straight to campus, clothes still smelling faintly of cardboard and sweat. There were days he'd sit in lectures barely conscious, phone tucked in his lap as he reviewed notes he hadn't had time to print. He wasn't the student who raised his hand or spoke up. He was the one scribbling thoughts down on fast food napkins, finishing essays during 10-minute breaks, reading textbooks while rocking his daughter to sleep. At home, silence had settled in like dust. His wife, once vibrant and full of laughter, had become a shadow of herself. Conversations became exchanges of necessities. Milk, diapers, deadlines. Her eyes no longer lit up when he walked through the door. He tried to explain the importance of school, of why he had to keep going, but every time it came out sounding like an excuse. To her, his absence felt like abandonment. And maybe, in some ways, it was. Their daughter was too young to understand why her daddy couldn't always play. Why he was gone before dawn and awake long after bedtime stories. She'd wait for him with picture books clutched in tiny hands, only to fall asleep before he made it back. He missed first steps, first words, moments he could never reclaim. Guilt was a constant companion, whispering that maybe ambition had cost him too much. He studied in library corners, head resting on open books. He typed final papers on his phone during lunch breaks. Some nights, the only warmth he felt came from a vending machine coffee and a sweatshirt he hadn't washed in days. And through it all, there were no claps, no recognition, just the grind and the ache and the hope that someday it would all mean something. Sometimes he wondered if anyone noticed, if professors could tell how hard he was fighting, or if classmates thought he was just lazy for turning in assignments late. No one saw the sacrifices, how he sold his wedding ring to buy a used laptop, or how he skipped meals to afford school supplies. Every step forward came with a price, and he paid in pieces of himself. He told himself it was temporary, that one day they'd all look back and say it was worth it, that the struggle would end with his daughter cheering from the front row and his wife smiling proudly beside her. But as he stood alone on graduation day, staring at those two empty seats, he felt the cruel irony of it all. He had earned this moment, but the people he loved most weren't there to see it. And the silence, the absolutely. Here's the 700-word section titled The Reception Room, focusing on the protagonist's experience with unexpected, genuine support. He almost didn't go. The reception was mentioned at the end of the ceremony, a quiet announcement drowned out by the whooping families and clicking cameras. Light refreshments and recognition for graduates in room 204. It sounded like an afterthought, a footnote to a day already carved into memory by absence. He lingered in the hallway, diploma still tucked under his arm, the echo of footsteps all around him. He could just go home. No one would notice. There was nothing waiting for him anyway. But something pulled him forward. Inertia, maybe. Or the need to stand somewhere that wasn't filled with empty chairs. Room 204 was nothing special. Beige walls, fold-out tables, fluorescent lights. But inside, it felt like a different world. A small group had gathered, laughter rising gently like steam from a pot left too long on the stove. A makeshift banner, "Congratulations, graduates," sagged slightly in the middle. The punch was warm, the cookies a little stale. But the smiles? Real. He stepped in slowly, unsure. A few classmates waved him over, genuine warmth in their eyes. They weren't the friends who knew his daughter's name or the ones who had seen his cracked phone screen at 2 a.m., but they had been there, in the same classrooms, the same late-night discussions, the same shared panic over finals. And now, they saw him. Not just the guy in the back row with bloodshot eyes, but someone who had made it. "Hey, you made it," one of them said, clapping him on the back. "We were wondering if you'd come." Another handed him a paper plate with a broken cookie and half a slice of sheet cake. "I saved you the last corner piece. Figured it looked the most earned." He didn't know what to say. Something in his throat tightened, unfamiliar and warm. A professor approached. Dr. Menendez, the one whose class he nearly failed before turning things around. She smiled and shook his hand with both of hers, like she meant it. "You should be proud," she said. "I saw how hard you worked, even when no one else did." He blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever said that to him. Not once. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He wasn't just the man who arrived late and left early, the one too tired to talk, too overwhelmed to connect. In this small room, surrounded by mismatched chairs and leftover decorations, he felt something shift. These people didn't know the whole story, but they saw enough to understand what it took for him to be here. And that somehow was enough. They asked him questions about his plans, his future, what he'd do next. No one asked where his family was. No one mentioned the empty chairs. They just saw him. He laughed. Actually, laughed for the first time that day. It felt strange, awkward even, like trying on a jacket you didn't know still fit. But it was real. He let himself sink into the conversation, allowed the warmth to fill the parts of him that had gone cold over the years. For a while, he didn't think about who wasn't there. He didn't think about what had been lost. He just let himself be, tired, relieved, proud, and still standing. As the reception wound down, he stood near the window, watching the sun start its descent. A classmate handed him a napkin with a scribbled quote she said reminded her of him. "The oak fought the wind and was broken. The willow bent when it must and survived." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket, a small gesture that meant everything. He hadn't expected kindness today. He hadn't expected to be seen. But here, in a room full of warm punch and broken cookies, he found something he didn't know he needed. A reminder that even when the people closest to you drift away, strangers can still reach out and pull you back toward the light. The house was quiet when he walked through the door. Too quiet. The front door creaked under his touch, a familiar sound that should have felt like home, but tonight, it felt like a hollow echo. He stood in the foyer for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and forgotten laundry. The quiet was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that followed after an argument, or the kind you find when a place is occupied by absence. He had expected something different. He'd hoped, at least. Maybe a card on the table, or balloons, something to mark the day, to celebrate with him, even if only in a small way. He had imagined walking through the door, his wife greeting him with a proud smile, his daughter running toward him with her tiny arms outstretched. They would have clapped, like the rest of the world had, only here it would have been for him, for his sacrifice, for his effort, for the years he spent working and studying and losing sleep. But there was nothing. The living room light flickered on as he moved further inside, his shoes scuffing on the wood floor. His wife, Anna, was asleep on the couch, a blanket draped loosely over her legs, her face softened in slumber. Her phone rested on the coffee table, untouched, and beside it a half-empty mug of cold coffee. He stood there for a long time, just watching her, heart sinking. Maybe she'd stayed up late waiting for him. Maybe she was just tired. He told himself that. But deep down, he knew better. She wasn't waiting for him. She hadn't even thought to stay awake. He dropped his keys onto the entryway table with a soft clink and walked toward the couch, carefully lowering himself onto the armrest. "Anna," he said gently, his voice catching slightly. "Anna, wake up." She stirred, blinking against the light and groaning softly, like she was annoyed at being disturbed. Her eyes fluttered open, but there was no spark behind them, no recognition, no joy. Just the hollow look of someone who had long stopped caring. She rubbed her face, stretching. "What time is it?" "It's late," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, calm. "I just got back. From graduation." He added it slowly, hoping for the reaction he needed, a glimmer of something, anything. Her eyes drifted from his face to the clock on the wall. "Oh, right. You made it, huh?" He swallowed hard, fighting the sting of her disinterest. "Yeah," he said quietly, his hand tightening around the sleeve of his gown. It was good. A lot of people were there. It felt..." He paused, wondering if he should even say it. Felt like a victory, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. He wasn't sure what would be worse, speaking the words or realizing they meant nothing to her. She yawned, stretching again. "I'm glad it went okay, I guess." Her voice was flat, distant. She didn't even look at him. It wasn't a big deal, right? It's just a ceremony. He stood there, frozen, the weight of her words sinking into him like a lead weight. He could feel the numbness creeping in, the familiar sting of disappointment. But this time, it wasn't just the years of exhaustion or the fatigue from juggling too much. This was different. This was something deeper. He felt small, invisible. "It's not just a ceremony, Anna," he said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "I've been working for this for years. I've been busting my ass." His voice broke for a second, but he forced it back. "For you, for us, for her, for our future. You don't understand what I gave up." She blinked at him, unfazed. "I do understand. It's just a piece of paper, Mark. It's not going to change anything. We're still in the same place. We're still stuck." The words hit him like a slap. His breath caught in his chest. He stared at her, incredulous, searching her face for some sign of remorse, something to soften the blow. But it was empty. She didn't see him. Not the way he needed her to. She had never seen him. He shook his head slowly, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I thought you'd be proud of me." Anna sighed and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I'm tired, okay? It's been a long day. I'm proud you graduated, but it's not like things are going to magically change now." And that was it. No card, no balloons, no congratulations. Just the same weighty silence that had been hanging over their home for months. Years, maybe. His throat tightened, the lump in his chest swelling. He stepped back, his eyes stinging with the realization that he had spent all this time fighting for something that didn't matter to her. Fighting to be seen, to be valued. And all he had left were echoes in an empty room. "Okay," he whispered, turning toward the hallway. "I'll go to bed." And as he walked away, he realized with painful clarity she had never seen the price of his ambition. She had never cared to understand what it had cost him. Not the late nights, not the missed moments, not the loneliness. And now, standing on the threshold of his own home, he didn't know where to go next. Here's the 600-word section titled, The Dinner Invitation, where the protagonist's journey shifts from loss to finding belonging. It was a late afternoon when the email came through. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through unpaid bills, the dull hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the empty house. The silence seemed louder than usual today. His wife had gone to bed early, and their daughter was staying with her grandmother for the weekend. The house felt too big, too still, and he felt the weight of every unspoken word between him and Anna. The email notification blinked on his phone. Department dinner, an invitation for graduates and faculty. He stared at the subject line for a moment, the words barely registering. He'd been expecting nothing from the department, especially after the reception. After all, he wasn't one of those students who had made connections, who had turned their struggles into stories of triumph. He had been just another body in the classroom, the guy who showed up late, the one who kept to himself. He hadn't been expecting anyone to notice, much less send an invitation. He opened it. Dear graduates, we are hosting an informal dinner this Friday evening to celebrate the completion of your academic journeys. It will be a small gathering, but we would be honored if you could join us. This is an opportunity to reconnect with professors and peers. It's casual, no speeches, no formality, just dinner and good conversation. We hope to see you there. Sincerely, Department of Humanities faculty. He closed the phone with a snap, his mind swirling. The idea of attending felt wrong. It was like a pity offer. They had sent it out of obligation, a polite gesture to acknowledge the ones who'd barely made it through. He wasn't part of the group that shared laughter in the hallways or studied in groups late into the night. He was just a placeholder. But then again, what else did he have? The thought of sitting in the silence of his house again, of stewing in his own disappointment, made him feel smaller. He thought about the empty seats at graduation, about the conversation with Anna, about how even his accomplishments had been met with indifference. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe for once, he could be around people who understood what it was like to fight through the dark. With a reluctant sigh, he tapped the yes button on the email. He'd go. It couldn't hurt to at least try. When he arrived at the small bistro downtown, the place was nothing extravagant, a cozy spot with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. Inside, several professors were scattered around the room, talking quietly amongst themselves. A few of his classmates were already there, engaged in low conversation. It wasn't a celebration, not in the way he'd imagined, but there was something surprisingly warm about it. No speeches, no awkward small talk, just an open space for people who had been through their own versions of struggle. Mark hesitated by the door for a moment, the weight of his self-doubt clinging to him. But before he could retreat, Dr. Menendez, the professor who had given him that small piece of encouragement, waved him over. "Mark, I'm glad you made it. Come on over. Food's just getting served," she called with a smile, pulling a chair out for him. He sat down, feeling strangely out of place among the group, but trying not to show it. Plates of pasta, warm bread, and glasses of wine passed from hand to hand. The conversation flowed easily, but it wasn't the typical light, breezy chatter you'd expect from a gathering like this. There were no shallow discussions about the weather or idle talk about what's next. Instead, the stories that emerged from each professor, and even some of the students, were raw and real. Dr. Menendez spoke quietly about her struggle with burnout after her first year of teaching. "I nearly quit," she admitted, her eyes shadowed by the memory. "I felt like I was losing everything that mattered, but sometimes you don't know how close you are to something until you push through." Another professor, Dr. Green, shared his story about juggling his career with being a single parent after a sudden divorce. It was chaos every day, but you learn that chaos can become the rhythm of your life if you let it. Mark listened, his initial discomfort slowly melting away. Each story, no matter how different, carried the same theme: struggle, sacrifice, resilience. He had been so focused on his own hardship that he hadn't realized how common the experience of feeling lost or alone could be. "I've never heard anyone talk about it like this," Mark found himself saying, surprised by the honesty spilling out of him. "I thought I was the only one who felt like I didn't belong, like it was all too much sometimes." Dr. Menendez looked at him, her expression softening. "We've all felt that way. Maybe not in the exact same way, but we've all carried our own burdens and still kept going. That's the part you should remember. You're not alone, Mark. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in the room. For the first time, he realized that the struggles he'd faced, the isolation, the exhaustion, weren't his alone to bear. There were others who understood, who had been through their own battles. And they weren't perfect. They were human, just like him. As the night wore on, Mark stayed, listening, sharing, and laughing. It wasn't about grand victories or empty applause. It was about being seen. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his coffee mug. The house was still quiet. It had been a few days since the dinner with his professors, and the warmth he'd felt there had begun to fade as soon as he walked back through the front door. The silence with Anna hadn't shifted. It was like walking into a room with no windows, the air stale and thick. He hadn't heard from her much since that night. She'd been distant, preoccupied, and he hadn't pushed. The last few weeks had taught him something. That forcing someone to see you, to acknowledge your efforts, wasn't worth the energy anymore. He could no longer chase after a validation that was never going to come. And the realization felt like a weight lifting from his chest. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Anna. He picked it up slowly, half expecting it to be another empty message about groceries or the state of the house, but the words on the screen were different this time. Sorry about that day. I should have been more present. I didn't know what to say. I'm proud of you. I really am. I just didn't show it the right way. Mark stared at the screen. For a moment, his mind swirled with emotions, relief, anger, frustration, and a deep, aching sadness. The apology was too late. The words felt hollow, like something she'd thrown together in a moment of guilt rather than from a place of understanding. He put the phone down. It wasn't enough, and maybe it never would be. He had spent years trying to prove himself to her, bending and breaking under the weight of her indifference. His entire journey had been driven by the hope that one day she'd see him, that she'd finally notice the sacrifices he had made, the dreams he had put on hold for the sake of their family. But as he looked at the message, something inside him shifted. He realized he didn't need her approval anymore. There was a truth he had been avoiding, one that had been gradually becoming clearer. His worth wasn't tied to her acknowledgement. He didn't need her to see him, to clap for him, to make him feel valid. His worth had always been his own, waiting to be discovered, and the moment he stopped looking for it in someone else's eyes was the moment he could truly begin to heal. It was the first time in years he felt like he was truly free. He opened his laptop, the screen bright against the dim light of the kitchen. There was a scholarship opportunity he had been considering, a grant for graduate school that he had pushed aside more than once. The thought of applying had always been tainted by doubt. Would he have time? Would he be good enough? But now, for the first time, it didn't feel like a leap towards something he thought he needed for validation. It felt like a step towards something he wanted, something that was his alone. He started typing. The application was straightforward, a few questions about his goals, about his academic background. But as he filled out the form, something began to stir inside him. A quiet excitement, a sense of purpose. It was the same feeling he'd gotten when he first signed up for school, that flicker of hope that had driven him even on the hardest days. This time, however, it wasn't about proving himself to anyone. It was about him, for him. For the first time in years, Mark wasn't doing this for anyone else. Not for Anna, not for his daughter, not for the professors who had barely known his name. This was for him, for the man who had fought through the exhaustion, who had juggled all the pieces of a broken life and still managed to come out the other side. This was about the person he had always been, buried beneath the weight of others' expectations. He hit submit on the application, a sense of calm settling over him. It wasn't about the outcome anymore. It was about taking control of his own future, about giving himself permission to exist outside of the narrative he had allowed to define him for so long. Mark leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. The door he had been trying to open for years, the one to approval and recognition, had closed, but in its place, a new door had appeared, one that led to the unknown, to the future that only he could shape. He didn't need her to see him anymore. He was already seeing himself. The grocery store was loud. Too loud. Mark pushed the cart down the narrow aisles, scanning the shelves without really seeing them. His mind kept wandering back to the grad school grant application, the one he had submitted just days ago. He hadn't expected much. The nagging doubt that had plagued him for years, the feeling of not enough, still hung over his shoulders like a shadow, but for some reason, he couldn't shake the quiet hope that had crept in after clicking submit. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. He reached the checkout line, feeling the weight of the cart's contents, the familiar unease that came with every purchase. As the cashier scanned the items, Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. "Congratulations! Your application for the Graduate Studies grant has been accepted." Mark froze, the words on the screen blurring as the world around him seemed to fall away. His breath hitched in his chest. He stared at the email, rereading it just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. His heart began to beat faster, and an overwhelming wave of disbelief rushed over him. The world seemed to pause for just a moment, and then, slowly, a grin tugged at the corners of his lips. He had earned this. The weight of the email sank in, not as a flash of triumph, but as a quiet truth. All those late nights, the juggling of work, the classes, the missed moments with his daughter, they had meant something. He had spent so many years chasing approval. And here it was, finally, not as a gift from someone else, but as something he had built with his own hands. He had done it for himself. He had made it, and he was enough. "Sir, your total is $48.75, the cashier said, snapping him back to reality. Mark blinked, still holding the phone in his hand as he pulled his wallet from his pocket. He handed over the cash, barely able to register the transaction, his mind still spinning with the news. His eyes went back to the screen and he read the email again, absorbing each word, each congratulatory phrase. As he left the store, his hands trembling slightly, he felt lighter than he had in years. The grocery bags dangled from his arms, but there was no sense of burden. For the first time in so long, it felt like something had shifted inside him. Not just an external validation, but an internal one, a knowing that he had built this path for himself. When he arrived home, the house was quiet as usual. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his professor, Dr. Menendez. "Hey, Mark, we're in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by to say congratulations in person. We've got some cookies, a little plant, and a card for you. Hope we can catch you at home." He stood there, dumbfounded for a second, the screen in his hand flickering with the words, his professors, here, in his house. Before he could process it, there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting company. He wasn't used to this kind of gesture, this kind of support. He wiped his palms on his jeans and walked to the door, opening it slowly. There they were, Dr. Menendez, Dr. Green, and a few of his classmates, standing there with warm smiles, a small potted plant in one hand, a card in the other, and a tin of homemade cookies between them. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. "Mark," Dr. Menendez said, her eyes lighting up when she saw him, "we couldn't leave without celebrating with you. You did it." He stood there, stunned, his mouth dry. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had never, not once, imagined that his professors would show up at his door, that they would care this much. "We just wanted you to know that we see you," Dr. Green added. "All the hard work, all the late nights, it didn't go unnoticed." Mark took the plant, feeling its weight in his hands, but the real weight settled in his chest. It wasn't just about the grant, or the cookies, or the plant. It was about something far more profound, the realization that he wasn't invisible. That, even in a world that often felt too big and too disconnected, there were people who truly saw him, who understood the struggle and recognized the journey. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Dr. Menendez replied. "We're proud of you. We're proud of all you've done." Mark felt the tears begin to well up, but he held them back. This wasn't about sadness. It wasn't about regret or longing. It was about a new understanding of what it meant to be seen, to be recognized not by blood, but by care, by those who had watched his quiet fight and understood its worth. As they left, the door closing softly behind them, Mark stood in the hallway, the small plant now sitting on the counter, the card tucked into his jacket pocket. He felt something he hadn't felt in so long. Peace. A sense of belonging. A quiet, resolute knowing that he had done enough. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for approval. He wasn't chasing validation. He had earned this, and it was his. The house had settled into its usual rhythm, though Mark had changed. The quiet moments between him and Anna, once thick with tension, now seemed to be filled with something more neutral. A shared understanding of what was and wasn't said. There was no dramatic argument, no break or tear in their relationship, but there was an unspoken shift. They had both retreated into their separate spaces, and the distance, while palpable, was no longer laced with the sting of resentment. It was as if the air between them had cleared, leaving room for both of them to breathe, even if their breaths didn't align. Anna was still distant in her own way. She had stopped apologizing, stopped making empty gestures. But Mark had stopped needing her to see him. He had accepted that the kind of validation he had once sought was not hers to give, and he was okay with that now. He wasn't angry. He wasn't resentful. He was just free. Their daughter Lily had been more curious lately. She watched him with new eyes, asking questions about his day, his studies, about the changes he had made. It was subtle, but it was there. She noticed when he was reading or writing late into the night, no longer just a distant figure to her. She began to ask what he was writing, her wide eyes full of wonder. "What's that you're doing, Daddy?" she asked one evening as she peered over his shoulder, watching him fill out another application, this time for a full graduate program. It wasn't just about a grant anymore. It was about him taking the next step, truly committing to this new path, and finally owning his story. "I'm writing about my journey," he said, his voice steady, though it carried a weight he hadn't realized was there before. "It's not always easy, but it's mine, and I want to share it, to let other people know it's okay to struggle, to not have all the answers." Lily didn't respond right away, but she watched him with an intensity that he hadn't seen before. She was growing, and in her quiet way, she was learning from him. She wasn't just observing his actions. She was watching how he navigated the world, how he approached life with a quiet determination. "Can I write a story like that too?" she asked, after a long pause. Mark smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "Of course you can. Everyone has their story to tell." As the days passed, he found himself slipping into a new rhythm, one that didn't require constant validation from others, one that didn't rely on outside approval to feel whole. He had made the decision to pursue graduate school, not for anyone else, but for himself. The application he wrote this time was different from the last one. It was raw, honest, and unflinching. He didn't hide behind the mask of perfect ambition or polished success. He wrote about the late nights, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, but he also wrote about the perseverance, the quiet victories, and the quiet knowledge that kept him moving forward. When he finished, he read it over. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like something he was submitting for someone else's judgment. It felt like a piece of him, a snapshot of his journey, and he was proud of it, proud of himself. The house was quiet that night, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his fingers hovering over the laptop, contemplating his next move. He had already submitted the application. He had already made the decision to step into this next chapter, not because it would fix everything, but because it was his choice. It was his path. He had long since stopped worrying about the future, about what anyone else thought. What mattered now was his own story. He had accepted that the life he had fought for, the life he had built, was enough. He no longer needed to prove anything. The doorbell rang, and Mark stood, moving toward it with a small smile. It was late, but he had been expecting this. When he opened it, he found a small package sitting on the doorstep, a handwritten card attached. Inside, there was a small, simple plant, the kind you'd keep on your windowsill, and a note that read, "We're proud of you. You've earned this. Keep going." It was from his professors again. A quiet reminder that, while the world outside of his home had been full of challenges, he had built a new sense of belonging, one that was rooted in care, not obligation. Mark stood there for a moment, the plant in his hands, before he brought it inside and placed it on the windowsill. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than any applause he had ever received. The next morning, Mark got up early, his body moving with a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. There was work to be done, projects to complete, papers to read, but there was something else too. A quiet excitement simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about achieving some idealized version of success. It was about continuing to move forward, to take ownership of his life in a way he never had before. As he got ready to step out of the door, heading to his next class, he paused for a moment in the hallway. Lily was still asleep, but he knew she would wake soon. He thought about her question the night before. Can I write a story like that too? He didn't have all the answers for her, but he knew this much. He was showing her how to live a life true to herself, how to tell her own story without waiting for someone else to write it for her. Mark smiled to himself as he closed the door behind him. Today was just another step, and for the first time, he didn't need anyone else to tell him he had earned it. He knew, deep down, that he had.